lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother, made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
Behind the smile. I remember the first time I caught the faint fracture in Camilla's carefully rehearsed composure. It was in the room that reeked faintly of smoke, the air heavy with a smell too sharp to mistake. Royal staff stood stunned, their whispers like cracks of thunder in the silence. And there at the center of it all stood Camilla, her smile the one she so often deployed to charm a crowd or soften a headline gone. In its place was a tightness, a mask slipping just enough to expose the calculation underneath. For years I had watched her master the art of public warmth. At charity events, her voice carried empathy. At formal banquets, her laughter came easily, almost disarming in its authenticity. She had built her rehabilitation in the public eye, not by dominance, but by subtlety, by appearing approachable in contrast to the grandeur around her. But behind closed doors where cameras did not reach, I began to notice how that smile was less reflex and more instrument. It was deployed with purpose, shielding, deflecting, persuading. That day, though, no smile could cover what we all saw. Belongings once cherished by Diana, personal fragments of a life that had defined William's childhood and haunted the monarchy, smoldered in the fireplace. Letters, perhaps, or garments recognizable to the staff who had once carried them with reverence. The sight was not simply shocking, it was sacrilegious, a betrayal enacted in the heart of the palace itself. Camilla's presence there was more than suspicious. It was damning. Her hands were steady, her expression composed, as though even destruction was part of a controlled performance. I stood frozen, my mind racing with questions. Was this an act of erasure? An attempt to purge the memory of the woman who would forever remain the people's princess? Or was it desperation, a moment of panic by someone who knew Diana's shadow would always cling to her crown? In that instant, I saw not the smiling consort rehabilitated in the press, but a woman cornered by history, struggling against a ghost she could neither befriend nor defeat. The weight of the scene bore down on all of us. Staff exchanged horrified glances, but no one dared intervene. Tradition had trained them in silence and discretion. Yet I knew silence would not suffice. What had been glimpsed in that room was not just fire-consuming fabric and ink. It was fire-consuming trust. It called into question every smile Camilla had offered, every word spoken about family unity, every gesture of respect toward Diana's legacy. Later, as I reflected, I realized how fragile her constructed image truly was. A single moment of exposure undid years of careful rehabilitation. The BBC had once chronicled her slow journey from vilified mistress to queen consort, pointing to her patience, her avoidance of controversy, her steady dedication to unglamorous causes. Reuters noted how her popularity had risen quietly, even if unevenly, through strategic appearances. Yet all of that seemed brittle when set against the image of burning possessions. In that moment, the mask slipped, and the questions it raised were far louder than any applause she had earned. For William, the discovery was not political, it was personal. His mother's belongings were not artifacts. They were fragments of memory, sacred remnants of a life taken too soon. To see them reduced to ash was an assault on more than history. It was an assault on love, on memory, on grief. I watched his face harden, his eyes dark with a mixture of sorrow and fury. The room itself seemed to freeze, every portrait on the walls silently condemning what had been done. Behind the smile then was a truth I could no longer ignore. Camilla was not simply a survivor of scandal, not simply a partner who steadied the king. She was a woman willing to confront Diana's ghost, not with words or reconciliation, but with fire. That choice, deliberate or desperate, revealed a depth of calculation far beyond public warmth. It marked the point at which perception could no longer shield her from consequence. Charm as strategy. Camilla's rise within the monarchy was not an accident. It was the product of years of careful positioning where charm became her most reliable shield. I had watched her cultivate this with methodical patience. In the early years, she never tried to outshine Charles. Instead, she allowed herself to be portrayed as his comfort, his confidant, the steadying figure in a turbulent world. At receptions, she leaned in close, speaking in tones that felt conspiratorial. as if every guest was entrusted with a secret. At charity visits, she touched hands bent low to meet eyes, and delivered smiles that newspapers frequently captured as candid warmth. Observers outside the palace often described this as sincerity, but I began to see it differently. Her charm was never careless, it was curated. BBC documentaries highlighted how Camilla deliberately avoided highly politicized causes, instead aligning herself with safe, human-centered campaigns, osteoporosis, awareness literacy programs, animal welfare. By choosing initiatives with emotional resonance but little controversy, she constructed a public image that was approachable, even endearing, while avoiding the political landmines that had ensnared other royals. It was a strategy as much as compassion, a way of being present without becoming a lightning rod. Her fashion choices told a similar story. Where Diana had embraced daring glamour, Camilla opted for muted tones and traditional cuts. These choices made her appear grounded, maternal, less threatening. They were the clothing equivalent of her public persona, careful, deliberate, understated. The Guardian once described her as comfortably ordinary, a phrase that might have seemed dismissive if it weren't so effective. Ordinary was safe. Ordinary was a shield. But charm, I came to realize, has limits. It works best when reinforced by trust, and trust cannot survive the sight of flames consuming belongings that once belonged to Diana. No carefully chosen charity or disarming laugh could undo that image. The staff who had witnessed it no longer saw a warm consort, but a woman with hands unshaken by destruction. And for William, the mask was shattered permanently. He could no longer reconcile the woman who smiled at hospital bedsides with the woman who presided over burning memories of his mother. Reuters once reported on how Camilla's public approval had steadily risen in the 2 decades following Diana's death, even reaching majority acceptance among older Britons. Yet those same polls revealed a striking generational gap. Young people remained skeptical, many unable to separate her from Diana's suffering. I found that gap mirrored in the palace itself. Senior staff who had worked with her for years still defended her as practical and dependable. Younger aides, many of whom had grown up idolizing Diana, struggled to look her in the eye after the fire. It became clear to me that charm was not simply her instinct, it was her survival strategy. She wielded it to navigate the hostility of tabloids, to soften the skepticism of the public, and to maintain Charles's unwavering loyalty. But strategy, however polished, cannot mask intent forever. When charm collides with evidence, it falters. And that was what I saw unfolding, a carefully built edifice of likability beginning to crack under the weight of suspicion. There is an irony here. In many ways, Camilla's charm had succeeded. She had risen from vilification to the throne itself, a feat almost unthinkable in the aftermath of Diana's tragic death. International outlets like Deutsche Welle and Al Jazeera often pointed to her as proof of the monarchy's ability to adapt to rehabilitate its own scandals through time and patience. But time cannot erase memory, and memory is what Diana represents. Her shadow stretches long, unyielding, making every act by Camilla subject to harsher scrutiny. As I stood in that smoke-filled room, the full fragility of Camilla's strategy became undeniable. Charm could not extinguish fire. It could not rewrite signatures, erase eyewitnesses, or explain away ash. It had served her well for decades, but charm alone could not shield her from accountability. What remained was the truth that strategy without integrity is brittle, and once broken, it cannot be pieced together again. Under Diana's unfading shadow, even at her most poised, Camilla could not escape the weight of Diana's presence. I felt it in every hallway of the palace where portraits of the late princess seemed to follow our steps with watchful eyes. To the public, Diana remained untouchable, a figure frozen in time, forever young, forever compassionate, forever betrayed. That unyielding legacy meant Camilla's every move was measured against a ghost, and in the firelit room where Diana's belongings were reduced to ash, that ghost felt closer than ever. The burning of Diana's possessions was not only a physical act, but a symbolic one. These items carried intimate memories, handwritten letters, cherished garments, gifts exchanged during tours. They were not relics of state, but fragments of a woman who had redefined monarchy in ways Camilla could never emulate. Watching them destroyed suggested something darker than practicality. It suggested an attempt to erase, to diminish the shadow that had always haunted her crown. Whether it was desperation or defiance, the act confirmed what so many already suspected: Diana was not just a predecessor. She was Camilla's eternal rival. Public opinion underscored this rivalry relentlessly. Polls conducted by YouGov showed that even as Camilla's popularity climbed in recent years, Diana remained far more beloved, with ratings that transcended generations. The BBC often revisited Diana's humanitarian work, reminding audiences of her boldness in walking through landmine fields or embracing AIDS patients at a time of fear and stigma. These images remained etched in the public consciousness, resurfacing whenever Camilla appeared at major events. No matter how carefully Camilla presented herself, she could never replicate that resonance. Inside the family, the shadow was even heavier. William, whose voice once cracked reading Diana's letter in public, carried his mother's legacy as both duty and personal pain. For him, Diana was not myth, but memory. Her laughter, her warmth, her sudden absence. When he saw Camilla near the fire surrounded by belongings once tied to that memory, it was not just a violation of history, but a violation of his own heart. Catherine, too, understood the symbolism. Wearing Diana's sapphire engagement ring was not mere sentiment. It was a statement of continuity, of loyalty to a woman who had shaped the monarchy's modern identity. Camilla knew this, and each time she saw that ring, she was reminded of the legacy she could never erase. International commentary amplified the tension. Reuters described Diana as the monarchy's most potent memory, while Al Jazeera analyzed how her shadow complicated the monarchy's efforts to modernize. Even in Germany, outlets like Deutsche Welle reminded readers that Diana's charisma had achieved what no PR strategy could replicate: genuine global affection. Against this backdrop, Camilla's efforts looked less like progress and more like survival. I often wondered if Camilla herself felt trapped by the comparison. Her eyes betrayed it occasionally at memorial services, at charity events linked to Diana's causes, when cheers for William and Catherine overshadowed polite applause for her and Charles. She may have been Queen Consort, but she was never Queen of Hearts. That title remained with Diana untouchable, immutable. And perhaps that was why in her most unguarded moments, she seemed to act not with confidence, but with a kind of simmering defiance, as though she could fight the shadow with fire. But fire cannot burn away memory. If anything, it inflames it. The staff, who had once remained neutral, began to murmur quietly after the fire, their horror turning into whispered loyalty to William. The incident, whether covered up or not, deepened the fracture within the palace. Camilla's smile no longer disarmed them. It unsettled them. They saw her not as a stabilizer, but as a woman at war with a ghost. And it is difficult to respect someone fighting a battle they cannot win. Diana's shadow remains the defining mirror in which Camilla must see herself. And in that mirror, the reflection is fractured, a queen consort crowned by time, yet forever haunted by the memory of the woman whose belongings she tried to consign to flames. Inner circle and influence. Camilla's power was never just about titles or appearances. It was about the people she gathered around her, the invisible network that shaped perceptions and decisions. I had seen how carefully she curated her inner circle: trusted aides who owed their careers to her patronage, journalists who received exclusive access in exchange for sympathetic coverage, and courtiers who quietly adjusted protocols to give her more space at the king's side. These relationships were not accidental. They were cultivated over decades, forming the scaffolding of influence she relied upon. The strength of that circle became most evident in moments of crisis. When whispers about Diana's jewels first circulated, articles suddenly appeared in sympathetic outlets praising Camilla's charity work or her unwavering support of Charles. The timing was uncanny, and it was clear these stories did not emerge by chance. They were planted, part of a strategy her advisors executed with precision. Influence in the monarchy is not always about commands. It is about narrative, about shaping what the public sees and what it ignores. And Camilla understood that game better than most. Still, the burning of Diana's belongings exposed the limits of even her most loyal protectors. Courtiers who once defended her reputation shifted uneasily in the days that followed, their whispers cautious, their defenses muted. The horror on the staff's faces as flames consumed those personal items could not be redirected with press releases or soft focus photo spreads. Influence has its red lines, and Camilla had crossed one. International reporting underscored this vulnerability. The Guardian had previously called her the power behind the throne, pointing to how her counsel often shaped Charles's decisions. Yet after the fire, even friendly outlets struggled to frame her actions in a palatable light. Al Jazeera raised questions about how much sway she held over palace resources, while Deutsche Welle noted that scandals linked to Diana's memory always carried explosive potential. The press, once carefully managed, now became unpredictable terrain. Inside the palace, her relationships strained. Some advisors doubled down in their loyalty, insisting that silence was the only way forward, that the monarchy could not afford another scandal of this magnitude. Others, however, quietly distanced themselves, sensing the shift in winds. I realized then that Camilla's circle was less a fortress than a marketplace of loyalties supportive, so long as her power remained unchallenged but fragile when her influence threatened to implode. Her sway over Charles remained her greatest strength. I watched how he leaned on her counsel, often deferring to her in private discussions. She had mastered the art of suggestion, rarely issuing direct instructions, but framing her thoughts in ways that made them difficult to refuse. Charles trusted her judgment perhaps more than anyone else's, and that trust gave her leverage no courtier could rival. Yet even he could not shield her completely. When the fire became impossible to ignore, his silence carried more pain than protection. Looking back, I saw the paradox of Camilla's influence. It was vast, but it was also brittle. She could bend narratives, sway decisions, and protect her allies, but she could not erase what had been seen. The inner circle she built was strong enough to elevate her to the throne, but not strong enough to prevent the weight of Diana's memory from crashing down upon it. Influence can buy time. It can shield from rumor, but it cannot change truth. In the end, her circle's protection was not enough. Staff loyalty shifted toward William, the press grew restless, and public sentiment hardened. The scaffolding Camilla had built over decades began to creak under the strain. And in that moment, I understood the limits of influence. It can hold power steady in calm waters. But when fire consumes memory, no circle is wide enough to contain the flames. Reckoning and what survives. When the dossier was finally complete, the signatures, the eyewitness accounts, the photographs, and the whispers turned into testimony. It landed like a stone on the king's desk. The confrontation was inevitable. Charles sat in his private study, shoulders heavy with the burden of both husband and monarch. William spoke first, his words sharpened by grief, laying out what had been witnessed in the firelit room. Camilla unflinching before the flames that consumed Diana's personal belongings. No words could soften the horror of that image. Camilla's defense was measured, almost weary. She claimed it was a misunderstanding, that items had been disposed of for preservation reasons, that memories lived in hearts rather than in objects. Her voice was calm. Her smile even returned at moments, as though charm could soften the edges of destruction. But the silence in the room was immovable. The staff's horror, William's fury, and the public weight of Diana's memory pressed against her like a tide no argument could withstand. The king's verdict came quietly but decisively. Camilla would not lose her crown too much precedent, and public stability depended on maintaining appearances, but she would lose her influence. Her apartments at Buckingham were reassigned. Her staff reduced, her engagements cut back to ceremonial functions. It was in every way that mattered a banishment from the heart of power. The woman who had spent decades climbing back from scandal now found herself sidelined once again, her survival instincts tested as never before. The press responded with a mixture of shock and inevitability. BBC reports spoke cautiously of restructured responsibilities, but the subtext was obvious. Reuters carried analyses of how Diana's memory continued to destabilize the monarchy, even decades after her death. Al Jazeera openly questioned whether Camilla could ever have been accepted fully, while Deutsche Welle noted that the monarchy's credibility rested more on William and Catherine than on Charles and his consort. For the public, the symbolism was clear. Diana's legacy had won again, even from the grave. Behind the headlines, the recovery of Diana's items became a quiet mission. What had not been destroyed was gathered, catalogued, and preserved under stricter protocols. For William, it was an act of healing a way to reclaim fragments of his mother's life. For Catherine, it was a way to ensure continuity to pass memory into the hands of their children untainted by scandal. Camilla's absence from this process was telling. Where once she might have guided discussions, now she stood apart, her voice muted by consequence. And yet even in diminished form, Camilla endured. That has always been her defining trait, endurance. She remained at Charles's side for ceremonies, her smile intact, her composure unbroken. But behind that smile was a truth that could no longer be hidden. Trust once broken cannot be restored. The palace corridors, once her domain of influence, grew quieter around her. Conversation shifted when she entered. Respect remained, but warmth had drained away. What survives then is a paradox. Camilla remains queen consort, her crown secure in legal terms. But her legacy is fractured. Her influence eroded, her image once again tied to controversy she could not escape. The fire that consumed Diana's belongings consumed too the illusion that Camilla's charm and strategy could outlast history's memory. What remains is Diana's shadow, brighter and more enduring than flames, a reminder that love and legacy cannot be burned away. For me, the reckoning was sobering. It revealed how fragile power is when it rests on perception, how quickly survival turns to exile when truth pierces the veil. Camilla had survived scandal, ridicule, and decades of skepticism. But survival is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance cannot survive betrayal. In the end, what endures is not her influence, but the monarchy's choice to preserve integrity by curbing it. The crown still gleams, the ceremonies continue, and the portraits remain on the walls. But the memory of that smoke-filled room lingers as a cautionary tale. For Camilla, the reckoning has come. And for the rest of us, what survives is the truth that some shadows, Diana's shadow, are too powerful to ever fade.